Hello! At the end of last year, I took delivery of the Dual Harmonic Oscillator, courtesy of AtoV Project. I did a first patch type video a few weeks back, but now that I've had a bit longer to get to know it, I wanted to do another video that explores it in a lot more depth. And I'm glad I took my time because this is a very deep oscillator. It's quite different from any other VCO I've used, and it really rewards experimentation. I've been coaxing some amazing sounds and textures out of it, and I'm going to break down 7 patches for you in this video. Here's a quick taste of what's coming up. Now, DivKid has already done a great job of explaining the architecture of the DHO in depth, so if you're new to the module, I recommend watching his videos, which I've linked to in the description. For that reason, I'm not going to get too bogged down with a detailed overview here, but I will just give you a quick rundown of the controls before I start patching. The DHO consists of 2 independent analog oscillators which each produce 4 octaves of triangle waves. These are mixed together at each oscillator's mix output, and there are built-in VCAs to control the relative levels of each harmonic via CV. You can also tap the outputs of each harmonic individually before the VCA stage. Each oscillator has through 0 FM, along with a VCA that lets you dynamically control the depth of that FM, and each FM input is normal to the mixed output of the other oscillator. There's a wavefolder stage which takes a mix of both oscillators plus an external input and gives you a single monster output. The expander module, which is included as standard, gives you access to sine, saw and pulse outputs for each oscillator, as well as opening up PWM and hard and soft sync. The really unique part of the DHO is the built-in modulation system. This is a little trickier to get your head around, but it's based around a simplex noise source that provides 10 pseudo-random CV values which you can apply to the levels of the 8 harmonics and the amount of FM on each oscillator. You can scroll through the noise map with the mod control, and because it's algorithmic you can get back to previous states by turning anti-clockwise. The mod CV input lets you move forward and backward through the values on either side of whatever coordinate is set by the mod encoder. If that wasn't powerful enough, there's also an LFO mode for this, where the mod values control the rates of built-in LFOs mapped to each parameter rather than the absolute value. Now, if all this sounds a bit complicated, then don't worry, it does become pretty intuitive once you start patching, and again, DivKid has done a great job of walking through this stuff. One last thing, AtoV Project have also just released the CLFO, which is a dual complex LFO with built-in ring mod, and the MMX2, which is a pair of matrixable mixers. I'll be using them throughout this video too, and yet again DivKid has done some great dedicated videos already if you want to know more about them. Anyway, let's crack on. Okay, let's get started by patching up a big, thick, rich stereo synth voice with loads of harmonic movement. I'm going to use a stereo signal path for this, so I'm going to use oscillator 1 for the left and oscillator 2 for the right. I'm going to take the mixed output of the harmonic oscillator section into these 2 mixers, one for the left and one for the right. I'm also going to take the saw outputs from the expanders into those mixers so I can mix a combination of the triangle harmonic section and the saw section. The output of those 2 mixers run into the wrong electronics parallax filter, which is a stereo filter. The output of that goes into Mordex data and then into the DivKid stereo strip. I'm going to control the whole patch from the key step 37. The pitch is going to the volt per octave, which will control both oscillators, and the gate output is going to the Vostok Fuji to trigger a couple of envelopes. One's going to go to the filter, one's going to go to the VCA. And that's basically it. I'm going to have some modulation from the CLFO and from Oct, another LFO, which I'll introduce in due course. And to start with, I've just got harmonic 1 turned up on both sides, tuned to the same pitch, which is just a simple triangle locked together, which sounds like this. Not super inspiring. Let's try detuning the right side very slightly with the fine tune. See on the scope that's now moving a bit because the frequency is different. And let's add a little bit of vibrato. I've got the LFO2 from the CLFO coming into the FM input of oscillator 2. Not that much, but just a little smidge of frequency modulation there just to give us a little bit of variety. Now, harmonics 2, 3 and 4, which are the octaves above, I can bring in manually. But let's use the mod matrix here, or the mod bus rather, to add some modulation. So let's hit the mod button and let's just turn up H2, 3 and 4 on both sides. Now this means that the kind of noise patterns that the mod bus creates will control the amplitudes of those 6 harmonic partials, basically all those harmonics above the root note. The root notes I'm not going to control with that, I'm going to keep them steady. If I come out of the mod bus, you'll now hear it's kind of randomly mixed them based on the value of the mod control. If I turn through the mod control manually, get this evolving sound with different harmonics, rising and falling on the left and right. Sounds pretty cool. If I go backwards, we get through the same pattern because it's kind of algorithmically generated noise, so it's repeatable basically. So I've got another LFO, the other side of the CLFO, coming into the mod CV input, and if I turn that up, that's basically turning that mod control to and fro from that coordinate that it's currently set at. So that's already a pretty harmonically rich sound. I've got the filter wide open now, not filtering it at all. Let's bring in a bit of the saw wave as well on both sides. This raspy extra undercurrent. Let's filter this down a bit. Bring in a bit of reverb. Let's add a bit of envelope to that filter. Let's add a bit of LFO to the skew of the filter. This is from Oct. So this will adjust the cutoff separately on each side, and let's bring in a bit of resonance. Okay, for this next patch I'm going to use the DHO to derive 2 independent voices, which I'm going to use to create a kind of ring mod, low pass gate, West Coast kind of atonal patch with a kind of couple of interlocking sequences. I'll use one voice. I'm going to take a pair of harmonics, just the triangle harmonics from either side of the DHO, run them through the ring modulator that's built into the CLFO over here, and then run that through a low pass gate in Sasumi. Then for the second voice, I'm going to take a kind of mix of triangle waves from both oscillators, run that through the wave folder that's built into the DHO, and then that'll go into the other low-pass gate in Sasumi over here. I'm going to have a little melodic sequence. I mean, I say melodic, it's going to be unquantized kind of note pitches coming from the Jasmine and Olive Trees traffic with the water firmware running. So this will be like the 8-step sequencer. And I'm going to derive some gate patterns from the Zularic repetitor from Noise Engineering here. I'm going to clock that from the CLFO LFO1, which you can see is beating pretty fast up there. That'll be my clock, and I'll use the other CLFO just to give a bit of modulation to the DHO for the triangle wave-folded voice. Let's get the ring mod voice going first. Basically, I'm going to take this harmonic and this harmonic from the other side, which you can hear are kind of tuned a fifth apart. They are both going to go into the ring mod. over on the CLFO, and the output of that sounds like this. So we get a nice rich sound with those two harmonics ring modulating each other. And I'm going to take that through the low pass gate. So a bit of a forest of cables here, but trust me, that's running into Sasumi over here. It's actually running through the blue trace on data as well. The green trace is the wavefolded side, which I haven't introduced yet. Let's get the sequence going. So I've basically got that square wave from one side of CLFO, running it through the Nekia Opal, which I'm just going to use as a little switch to turn that on. So now that's clocking to lyric repetitor, which is giving this gate pattern, which is triggering an envelope in the Vostok Fuji. And that envelope is controlling this low pass gate. Now I've got a second gate pattern from lyric repetitor clocking a second, or triggering a second envelope in Fuji, which is opening the second low pass gate, and feeding into there I've got this wavefolded mix of a couple of harmonics from both sides of the DHO. That sounds a bit like this. So that gate pattern is kind of out of sync with the sequence, which means some notes are changing behind it, but I quite like the sound of that. Let's just go back to the ring mod sound. Like, I made this a little bit more interesting by taking, one of the good things with water is you get 3 related but phase shifted outputs of that sequence. So let's take the one that's 3 steps behind, and let's put that into the volt per octave of the second oscillator. So now we get this pattern that's a bit more abstract. Let's also run that through a bit of spring reverb, which is just out of shot. It's the Music Theme Modular DIY spring up here. So that's sounding quite atmospheric. Let's switch to a different pattern in Zillow Repetitor. Quite like this one with the 2 green dots like that. Now let's bring up the triangle, folded voice rather. You can get some pretty cool effects if we play with the octaves of the 2 voices as well. Let's adjust that first one. And now, just because I can, I'm going to take a copy of that clock into this clock divider. And I've got some drum modules off screen. I think this will really come alive with a little kick drum. Let's go into the divide 4. Changing the octave again. Let's take a hi-hat. So this is all clocked from that LFO, there's no PAMs or any other kind of drum machine here. Got a few drum modules off screen, just my usual tip-top analog 808 and 909 modules. Pattern again. Great for this kind of quite abstract techno-y kind of grooves. So the oscillators in the DHO also have an LFO mode, which means you can use those kind of complex mixes of harmonics at low frequency rates to create really interesting modulation shapes. To toggle LFO mode, you just hold the button next to the frequency control. If you turn it clockwise, it's in audio mode, and if you turn it anti-clockwise, it's in LFO mode. So I've got the output of oscillator 1 running through the scope here, and I've just got the first harmonic triangle turned up. So I thought, why don't we use some of these more complicated shapes, which I can generate by turning up some other harmonics, and then quantize that shape at regular intervals to make a pitch sequence, and drive that pitch sequence to the second voice in the DHO, the second oscillator, and use that as a synth voice. So one side is creating a pitch sequence effectively, the other side is playing it. I've set this up with the output of oscillator 2 running through the wrong parallax filter and then through the DivKid stereo strip. I've got some envelopes from Vostok Fuji again. I'm going to run the LFO output from oscillator 1 through one of the MMs here for a bit of attenuation and offset, and then into the disting quantizer. And then I'm going to use the first LFO and CLFO again as the clock, like in the previous patch. I'm going to run that through a clock divider. So that's going to trigger the quantizer, and it's also going to reset that LFO. I've got a slow division of that clock going into the hard sync input of the LFO. Let's just get that clock routed in. And the little blue trace is the clock pulses, so you can see that's the rhythm. And you can see as this LFO is going up and down, the pitch is following along with that. And by changing the shape, so this reset is hitting every 16 notes, which is basically giving us a kind of 16-note phrase, which then repeats itself, which is, you don't have to have that reset, but I just find it makes the pattern feel a bit more like a pattern rather than just randomness. Now, we have also got individual outputs for these harmonics, so what we've effectively got is a set of 4 triangle LFOs available at these H outputs. So I thought, why not use some of these higher frequency ones to modulate the amplitude of the higher harmonics in the voice. So let's go from, say, H1 output of oscillator 1, or LFO 1 rather, into H2, 3 and 4, so these higher harmonics. And then these will kind of rise and fall if I turn up these. So these harmonics will come in and out at a kind of related rate to that main melody shape. Which I think gives a really interesting bit of timbral variation. And just by dialing in these, huge range of kind of arpeggios or note patterns available. So one of the many very cool things about the DHO is having these harmonic CV inputs, which are basically inputs for VCAs for all the harmonics of each oscillator. That means with external envelopes or LFOs, you can kind of control every individual harmonic or every individual octave. For this patch, I'm going to use the Zilaric repetitor again to generate some trigger patterns, which are going to trigger envelopes from the Vostok Fuji, and I'm going to use 4 of those envelopes to control the first 2 harmonics on each of those 2 voices. And then I'll bring in a bit of modulation. I'm going to FM the first one, and I'm going to run the second one through the built-in wave folder. Let's get the sequence going, or get the pattern going rather. So they're just tuned an octave apart, and we're getting 2 octaves worth of harmonics on each one. And with this kind of rhythmic pattern that's coming through from Zilaric, we're getting this quite complex kind of rhythmic thing. Let's bring in some FM on the first oscillator, and I'm actually just going to take the harmonic 1 from the second oscillator, which is tuned an octave below the first one, into the FM input directly. So you can now hear one of that tone, that's the green trace, is getting a bit more variety. And let's take a bit of random CV of that FM amount. I've got the R&D step here, firing off one of the same triggers that's triggering that envelope to give us a random voltage on some of those steps. And the second voice is running through the wave folder. Let's add a bit of folding, and again I've got R&D step on one of those trigger steps. control the amount of folding. By playing with these envelope decays, we can get a variety of those note lengths. Now, pitch-wise, I'm actually using water again with two out-of-phase 8-step sequences. At the moment they're all tuned, every step's tuned to the same note and they're both going into both oscillators, so we're only really hearing these octaves. But if I start to just change one or two steps on this sequence, we very quickly get something a bit more interesting. These are running through a quantizer as well, so it's kind of, although it's quite atonal, it's still kind of in a recognisable key. Let's bring in some drums too. For one last thing, I'm going to take a couple of LFOs from the CLFO, and I'm going to go into the VCAs of harmonics 3 and 4 on the first voice. These are running quite slowly. These are just bringing in little waves of those higher harmonics, which are being FM'd quite heavily. Playing with these note steps on the sequencer has quite a dramatic effect. Remember, this is all coming out of a single oscillator. Got several layers of sound here. So although the DHO obviously really excels as a big complex oscillator, it can also shine just as well with a really simple approach. So in this patch I just want to explore using the sine wave outputs to do some nice through zero FM. I'm just going to be sequencing it using the Jasmine Auditory's Water, which is going to be clocked from Pam's Pro Workout off screen. I'm going to be triggering an envelope from Fuji, which is going to open the Sasumi low-pass gate again. We're just going to listen to oscillator 1, which is running through the scope, and I'll use oscillator 2, which is tuned an octave below oscillator 1 initially, that's routed to the FM input, and I'll just introduce a bit of through zero FM. Let's have a quick listen to that sine wave sequence. And through that LPG with a little snappy envelope, it already sounds quite pleasant. But if I bring this oscillator 2, which is tracking the same pitch sequence but just an octave lower, bring up the amount of that FM slightly, we get this nice, more richly harmonic tone. And I'm also sending a copy of the clock into R&D step to give me a kind of random bipolar voltage, so I can introduce that to the amount of FM. So some notes will have more heavy FM than others. Just playing with that envelope time. Now this is an octave apart. If I start to tune oscillator 2 up a semitone or two, we get much more clangorous sounds. And I'll just go semitone by semitone. Reach an interval of a fifth like this, it starts to sound harmonic again, but in a slightly different tone to the octaves. We can get another variation on this tone by syncing oscillator 1 to oscillator 2. You can just take the square wave output of 2. I'm just going to go into the soft sync of 1. And that locks the tuning even harder. And now if I adjust those semitones again, that's basically transposing the pitch of the sequence now, because oscillator 2 is dominating. Go to hard sync 2. Sounds even brighter, a little bit clickier. So this is just 2 sine waves, but we're getting a much richer sound. Now, the DHO is obviously super powerful when you combine both oscillators and cross-modulate them, but I wanted to try a patch that just uses them completely independently for 2 quite contrasting voices. Oscillator 1, I'm just going to use the square wave output from the expander. That sounds like this if I get a little sequence going. So I'm using the BeatStep Pro. And at the moment it's just running through delay 1, but dry, and then parallax, and then the DivKid stereo strip. Firstly, let's just bring in a bit of chorus effect from delay 1. And let's filter it down. I'm going to use a combination of envelope and LFO, which I'm mixing up here in MM, going to the filter CV input. Resonance. So that's a nice big chorusy square wave thing. I'm using another LFO from CLFO to modulate the coarse delay time on delay 1. So it's a very short delay that just gives us a chorus effect. And for the other voice, I'm trying something completely different where I'm taking the 4 harmonic, the 4 different triangle harmonic octaves out, and rather than mixing them in the DHO, I'm combining them in the New Systems Instruments Babel down here, which is a kind of logic, analog logic utility. And that's the blue trace here on data. Let me just turn the modulation down, and let's just have a quick listen to that signal. So this is the 4 triangles combined using analog logic, and at the moment it is outputting the kind of middle value of whatever those 4 triangles are representing at each point in time. And if I adjust the middle value here on Babel, I go down to the kind of minimum value and the maximum value. And then by modulating that with an LFO, you get quite a nice shifting timbre. It's a little bit like ring mod, but it's with 4 sources. And it's quite different to the sound of the 4 triangles just mixed. Let's go back in. I'll take the output from low pass gate using Sasumi again, and let's run a completely different kind of sequence into there. I'm just pinging the LPG with the gate output from the BeatStep here, so there's no envelope, just the natural decay of that Vactrol. And let's add a bit of reverb and delay to this. And let's bring in the square wave sequence too. And let's add a kick drum. So it's great having effectively 2 voices for the price of 1 from this module. Okay, to finish, I'm just going to chuck what I can only describe as a shitload of modulation at the DHO to see how gnarly we can get it on a big drone. I'm going to use all 8 outputs of the DivKid and Instro Oct here to control the harmonic levels of all 8 harmonics across the both oscillators. I've tuned them a fifth apart. Let's just get going. I'm just going to bring in H2 on both so you can hear that fifth. Bring up these attenuators for the CV inputs. So these VCAs are now controlling the levels of those, and these are the fastest 2 I've got on Oct. Let's just bring up the others one by one. I'm going to set the bass level of the high harmonics slightly lower, to emphasize the bass end a bit more, and also because they get quite overwhelming. I've bathed the whole thing in a bit of supermassive reverb. Now let's take one of the unipolar LFOs, control the amount of fold in the wave folder, so they're both being mixed through the wave folder here. Sounds pretty epic, and that's going to kind of fade in and out at a related rate to some of these other LFOs. For the icing on the cake, I've got a couple of these. Just let that die away. I've got these diode logic pairs, which I'm going to take a couple of them to the FM inputs. This is from the Oct Expander. Get these kind of clouds of almost kind of digital noise. Although there's nothing digital happening here, it's all analog wave folding and analog oscillators. Really quite an extraordinary sound from some LFOs being piped in. I'm just going to sync oscillator 2 to oscillator 1 just as the icing on the cake here. I'm going to go from the square wave out of oscillator 1 into the soft sync of oscillator 2. So that's going to lock it to the frequency of oscillator 1 even though it's tuned up. So that kind of reinforced the fundamental of this drone even more. So I'm going to leave it there for now. Hopefully these patches have given you a bit of a flavour of what this awesomely powerful oscillator is capable of. It might not offer the same sort of instant gratification that you get from simpler modules, but it can do stuff that's difficult or impossible to produce any other way. To be honest, I feel like I'm still only scratching the surface of what the DHO can do, so I'm sure I'll be exploring it for years to come. Anyway, if you've made it this far, please leave a like and a comment and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.